You've likely already heard that ADHD is believed to be a problem in the production or processing of dopamine and or norepinephrine, which are neurotransmitters. Now, what does that mean? How does it relate to your symptoms, the type of medication that's best for you, the dosage, and also addiction? Stick with me and I'll teach you the simplified neuroscience of ADHD.
This is a neuron, also known as a brain cell.
Neurons are mostly found in the brain, but there's tons of neurons all over your body detecting stimuli and sending messages up to the brain for interpretation. Every sense that we have, smell, sight, hearing, touch, all of those involve neurons sending messages like a game of telephone all the way up to the brain. How do they do this? Well, they're connected end to end. Each one has a sending end and a receiving end. Now, when I say connected, I don't mean physically. They're not touching. There is a microscopic space called the cleft. In this space, little messenger chemicals called neurotransmitters get expelled and then absorbed. Now, there are specific receptors on the receiving end that are built specifically to receive a specific neurotransmitter. So there's a difference between dopamine receptors, norepinephrine receptors, acetylcholine receptors, GABA receptors, any neurotransmitter you can think of. Now, these neurotransmitters each have their own type of message that they're sending to the brain. For instance, dopamine is associated with gratification, satisfaction, resolve. Norepinephrine is associated with action, get up and go. That's why it's associated with the fight or flight response. Now, depending upon what kind of these messenger chemicals or neurotransmitters are being received, that's going to influence the electrical signal that flows through the neuron from one end to the next to pass the message on to the next neuron. Eventually, this message gets passed all the way up to the brain, and the brain interprets it and responds accordingly. So if you're deficient of dopamine, let's say maybe you don't produce enough of it or you process it too quickly, you're always left wanting more. You don't really get that sense of satisfaction, gratification. You don't feel like you're resolved and satiated and done. That deficiency leaves you constantly craving, needing, urgently seeking dopamine. Now, everyone's a little different in how much dopamine they get from certain activities. That's why all of us have different preferences. But generally speaking, we tend to get dopamine from things like food, sex, building and creating things, learning things, new stimuli. Some of us even get it just from colors and music. Now, historically, in the caveman days, this was actually a pretty helpful thing to have because it constantly made you seek out more food and shelter and build things and be innovative and seek out new lands. But in today's world, what it can do is it can make your brain prioritize those kinds of things instead of what you consciously know is most important in your life at that moment. So rather than make that doctor's appointment, you're more likely to go get a snack from the pantry. In fact, you may even forget that you need to dry your laundry because you're so wrapped up in this new song that you're learning. Now, norepinephrine has a very interesting relationship to dopamine in terms of receiving and filtering out stimuli. Now, the role of norepinephrine is to receive stimuli as much as possible. For simplicity, let's just speak in terms of vision right now. As I sit here, I see a lot of different things around me. I see window blinds, I see painted texture on the wall, I see a piano, my speaker, a couple of computers, a little bit of messiness over here. Now, the role of dopamine is to help the brain filter out what stimuli is not important at the moment. So if I'm going to engage in any sort of activity, I can't be distracted by the fact that there's light coming through the window or that there was a bird that flew by. I can't have my attention drawn to my dog who's curling up and lying in the corner. Now, is it helpful to be hyper aware of your environment all the time? In emergencies, certainly. But in everyday life, when we actually need to be focused on tasks, it can be counterproductive. So when your hyperfocus is engaged in something that gives you a tremendous amount of dopamine, for me, that's playing the piano, you can get completely consumed with that and not even realize what's going on around you. That's because the dopamine has helped your brain completely filter out all of that other stimuli. So someone may be even calling my name and I have no idea what's going on. Now, there are two main types of ADHD medication. One increases your dopamine and your norepinephrine. Those are stimulants. Non-stimulants simply lower your levels of norepinephrine. So if you're deficient in norepinephrine and dopamine, stimulants are going to help you quite a bit. Now, if you have enough dopamine, but you're just high norepinephrine, and so all the stimuli is what's distracting you, lowering your norepinephrine can be very helpful. Now, what if you have normal levels of norepinephrine, but low dopamine? There aren't any medications that just raise dopamine for ADHD. Why? I really don't have any idea, and that's what I'm trying to get answers on right now. Currently, the only medications that I can find that just raise dopamine are for Parkinson's. As some of you may know, we have an elevated risk of Parkinson's disease because it's a dopamine problem. Right now, the standard practice, if you have regular norepinephrine levels and low dopamine, is to give the person a stimulant to raise both, and then supplement that with a non-stimulant to lower the norepinephrine so that they're evened out. Now, what if you're already naturally high norepinephrine and low dopamine? That's me. Well, you'll probably be put on stimulants to raise your dopamine, but you'll have a heck of a hard time trying to lower that norepinephrine. You'll need a non-stimulant and probably a beta blocker. My question is, and I would love to hear this from an expert in the field, why aren't we treating ADHD with Parkinson's meds? Because they're not controlled substances and they're non-addictive. It seems like those of us who have normal or high norepinephrine levels would really benefit from that rather than having to manipulate our stimulant with other medications. Now, another big difference to keep in mind is how your body metabolizes medication. Now, when I say metabolize, I don't necessarily mean your digestive tract in the way that we think about losing weight. Your body absorbs and processes medication in very complex ways involving a lot of different parts of the body. Just as we all look very different on the outside, we're all very different on the inside. Your body might not process this medication hardly at all, and so you are genetically resistant to a medication. You'll likely have to be on a crazy high dosage, or you'll have to find some other medication that's similar but doesn't get processed quite in the same way. Additionally, the opposite can happen. You can be very sensitive to a medication, and it could have a huge effect on you. You might be a fast metabolizer of that medication, so it hits you quicker and it wears off quicker. You might be a slower metabolizer, which means you'll have a bigger delay in when your medication kicks in. Doctors combat all of these problems with a ton of trial and error, so it's really, really important for you to stay in constant communication with your doctor about your dosage, your type of medication, and how it's making you feel. I know it's completely ableist and counterintuitive for someone with ADHD, but if you can keep a meds journal when you're starting your meds, it would be tremendously helpful for you and your doctor. Another option is you can have your DNA analyzed, and you can find out then if you have a genetic predisposition to a resistance to a medication. My favorite genetic analysis resource is sequencing.com. They read 100% of your DNA. If you've already had your DNA read by 23andMe or Ancestry.com, you can import that data for free. They'll read it and give you whatever information they can derive from it. However, those sites tend to only read about 0.1% of your DNA. If you go through sequencing.com, it will be a fee, but they'll read 100% of your DNA. Not only will this help you with finding an effective medication, but you can find out all sorts of genetic predispositions to rare diseases like connective tissue diseases. As some of you may know, we're actually very prone to these rare connective tissue diseases, but it's very hard to get diagnosed because it's not on the doctor's radar and the symptoms look very sporadic and unrelated. So, analyzing your DNA can kind of give you a shortcut to helping the doctor know where to look. I really hope these tools have helped you, and I hope this clears up some difficult parts of your meds journey.